Welcome everyone to this ISDP webinar on climate crisis in Tibet. Uh, I am Jagannath Panda, heads the Southeast and Indo-Pacific Center at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. This is the third webinar in series on our project on climate crisis in Tibet. We had a couple of webinars previously covering the climate challenges in Tibet. And also we have discussed earlier about the water diversion projects that the Chinese are carrying out. We want to find out through today's webinar about the mining activities that the Chinese are engaged in the Tibetan Plateau. In order to discuss some of these issues, we have a fine set of experts who have done enormous research on the subject. They have written about how far the Chinese have gone to the extent of mining and exploring the resources in the Tibetan Plateau. And they are going to share with us their domain expertise knowledge about the subject, about mining and the environmental state of affairs in the Tibetan Plateau. We have Professor Martin Mills. He's the chair in anthropology and director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He has written enormously on the Tibetan issues. He's the author of Identity, Rituals and State in Tibetan Buddhism. His research interest lies in the history of religious and constitutional organizations in Tibetan monastic and governmental life. His entire bio and his profile is well visible in the public domain. You could also see it in the ISDP website. So welcome to you, Professor Martin. We have then Gabriel Lapte. He's a well-known Tibetologist and spent years of living in Tibetans in exiles. And also, currently he's based in Australia, and he works on the Chinese politics, covering the Tibetan issues. He regularly writes about the mining issues, about the environmental issues, covering in the Tibetan Plateau. We are fortunate to have him today, despite of the fact that he is not in his best of health. Welcome to you, Gabriel. Thank you. Then we have Dr. Sripanna Pathak. She's an associate professor and the founding director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at the Jindal School of International Affairs at the O.P. Jindal Global University in Haryana in India. She's a China expert and written about China-India relations, boundary dispute, and geopolitical issues covering China and India in various domains. He is fluent in English, Hindi, Chinese, Bengali, and Assamese, some of the domestic Indian languages. Glad to have you, Dr. Sripanna. Then we have Dr. Suja Anna Ferengi. She's an associated research fellow with the Institute for Security and Development Policy. She's our in-house expert. Also, she's an affiliated scholar at the Department of Political Science, the University of Brussels. Currently, she's based in Taiwan. She also heads the associated network of 9-Line, a prolific writer, has published a couple of books on China, and recently she has published a book titled Partners in Peace, Why Europe and Taiwan Matters to Each Other. Welcome to you, Dr. Suja. Then we have Dr. Lobsang Yangso. She's a senior environmental researcher in the International Tibet Network in India. She has focused on climate issues in Tibet, and particularly covering issues like water scarcity and climate change issues in the Himalayan regions. She obtained her PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she has been writing on the water issues to the Tibetan issues in a number of international forums. Glad to have you, Dr. Lobsang. Let me begin by saying that this webinar is third in the series, as I mentioned, and we have been trying to understand what kind of activities that the Chinese are currently engaged in the Tibetan Plateau. And it is a well-known fact that probably in recent years, Tibet has undergone a lot of changes. There has been a massive number of infrastructural projects has come up. There has been a quite a massive scale of military modernization has happened in the Tibetan Plateau. There is kind of forced relocation of the Tibetans has happened in the, the migration of the Tibetan communities going to other areas of China. Then most importantly, there has also been a number of mega dam water diversion projects in the Tibetan Plateau. But one thing which has not really been discussed much in the international domain is the mining activities of the Chinese. So I would like to start by inviting Professor Martin here, as he has worked on the subject and prepared quite a number of maps to share with us. How do you really see the Chinese activities when it comes to mining exploration activities in the Tibetan Plateau? To what extent they have advanced their activities there? And how is it, more importantly, how is it affecting the climate issues in the Tibetan Plateau? Do you see that the situation is becoming alarming because of the Chinese activities? How is it going to impact the climate conditions in the Himalayan regions? If you could share with us your thoughts, that will be wonderful. Then we'll go to the other panelists, inviting them. Over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to the ISDP for organizing this webinar. I thought I'd just kind of kick off, since I was listed as the first person to go, to kind of give a context, and many of my esteemed colleagues will be able to talk about specifically the Tibetan position. But what I wanted to do here is actually kind of initially kick off by sort of saying, how does all of this fit into the way in which China has changed in a larger sense, and the degree to which it treats the Tibetan Plateau effectively as a kind of peripheral mining zone. To understand that, we really need to understand the way in which China is transforming both within its own borders and externally, and the manner in which that transformation is actually accelerating. Now, I'm going to use a few slides here, and I'll try and be as quick as I can, just to give a kind of sense of how much things have changed during my lifetime, for example. I'll just quickly share. There we go. I hope you can all see that. Now, I'm going to momentarily sort of channel the Chinese state here and look at the way in which it thinks about these problems. So you'll excuse the map saying Xizang there for the Tibetan Plateau region here. I would personally prefer neither Tibet nor Xizang, but maybe something like Kawachen, which would be an actual Tibetan term, but there we go. If we go back to the period in the wake of the Cultural Revolution and the opening up of China to the world economy, that created China as the kind of workshop of the world that feeds all of our needs, however illegitimate those needs may be, it kind of, I mean, if we go back, Tibet back in that period of time was largely regarded as a peripheral security domain. So the reason for this was very straightforward. It was really hard to get stuff onto and off the Tibetan Plateau because of the sheer physical and geological challenges that stood in its way. But at the same time, it was seen as existing quite deep in the Asian continent, and that provides certain advantages. Most particularly from a security perspective during the Cold War, Tibet was regarded as part of a core industrial area that was seen as protected, especially during the early Cold War, from nuclear attack. Nuclear attack at this point in time was largely based on relatively short-range ballistic missiles that would come in, that were submarine launched from the South China Sea and places on those lines. And the attack would seem to affect cities like Beijing or Chongqing and so forth. So it was necessary to keep a kind of fail-safe, which was a core industrial area of limited, in particular, nuclear production and oil and gas production that was quite limited around that time. But this was seen as a kind of backup and fail-safe for the Chinese state. This all changed really around the sort of early 1980s with the shift towards the economic liberalization under Deng Xiaoping, who effectively opened up the Chinese economy and said, you know, we can provide workshops and sweatshops and new factories and new opportunities that will take on the West at its own game of capitalism. Now, in the beginning, as people my age will remember, this was overwhelmingly the East Coast cities over here on the sort of right-hand side. And those East Coast cities could really only be fed in industrial terms with raw materials that came by sea. The reason for this is carrying large mineral resources is best done by sea and is really expensive by land. So pulling anything out of Tibet was always going to be a lot harder. Okay, it did occur a little bit. Certain high-end products that were very expensive, like gold, they were taken largely by private companies that were working in the Tibetan area, private mines that would try and get stuff. Basically speaking, gold was almost the only thing that was worth enough to carry all the way to the coast. So there was kind of a bit of a Wild West feel, as generally speaking it was in Tibet in the 1980s. It wasn't a part of a central government process, but that soon changes. In particular, from about 2000, we see the increasing influence of this kind of, well, we've been successful building the East Coast cities, but we have the problem of the West. And from the Chinese state's perspective, this was understood. Here you can see on the diagram a kind of line that I've drawn down the People's Republic of China. And this line effectively marks the population and industrial capacities. Everything on the right-hand side of the line, close to the sea, this carries 80% of the population at that point of time. It carries 80% of the industrial capacity, and everything on the left-hand side of the line, everything west of that line, is effectively speaking largely undeveloped as far as the PRC is concerned. It's got mineral resources, it's got all of those things, but it's just really hard to get them. And the Communist Party state engages in what it now calls the Great Western Development Strategy, which is to do two things. The first is to build cities in central China, that is in the central Chinese mainland here, cities in particular like Xi'an, Chongqing, Chengdu, and build those up as industrial centers too. Now, to feed those, you need oil, gas, and minerals coming from deeper inland in Tibet and Xinjiang and areas on those lines. And this creates a kind of drive of state-sponsored activity to build that in order to feed the Chinese mainland and the lowland areas and those central cities. We can see these central cities here. That's our little red triangle there. But we also see the growth of oil and gas pipelines that begin to cross-cut across the People's Republic of China, particularly towards Xinjiang, towards inner Asia, and feeding down into areas as far south as Shenzhen. And we see from 2006 onwards, the building of the railway that links Lhasa to Beijing and that provides access. Most of the newspapers cover it in terms of tourists going to Lhasa, but actually this is also state police, this is military, and this is minerals are being transported along this line. It's a vital strategic resource, which is, I hasten to add, and come back to this later, being affected by climate change. I've drawn this picture here. It looks quite simple. I drew this is 2010. If we go to, this is thanks to the Baker Institute here, this is a more complex version that exists today. It's a much more elaborate series of strategic pipelines, patterns and processes and resource extraction that is spreading out all the way into places like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, up to the east towards Eastern Siberia. In particular, Eastern Siberia has always been a source of, while China, for example, signed hardwood treaties to not use hardwood for things on those lines or not cut them, and it had self-interest in that because cutting down hardwoods promotes flooding. It got those hardwoods instead largely from Eastern Siberia, which was also a bit of a Wild West, but it would be a bit of a Wild East in this case. So we see these kind of green and brown lines going up towards the east. As far as this pattern is concerned, Tibet becomes a potential. I mean, it is always seen as having potential. The Chinese state word that they use for Tibet is Xizang, which means Western storehouse. And this was always understood as a potential place for minerals because of the fractured nature of the Tibetan Plateau, which sort of leaves a lot of minerals on the surface. It's just really hard to get at them. And those mineral resources can be seen up here in the north of the Tibetan Plateau, down around Lhasa, down in the south, and in the east. A lot of those resources can be, certain limited access can be achieved through, particularly through the introduction of the railway, and from about 2010 onwards, through the upgrading of mining sites across the Tibetan Plateau. There weren't as many as there are in the Chinese mainland, but those mining sites were upgraded largely with help from, it was state-owned enterprises in collaboration with generally British, but mainly Canadian mining companies out of Vancouver and Toronto that sought to upgrade these so that they could aid with the production in those central cities. The resources I put in here, I'm afraid this map is a little out of date, but just to give you a kind of quick sense of this, the bigger things that we can look at here in particular is lithium. Lithium for electric vehicles, for batteries, for green technologies. Lithium comes, largely speaking, in two regards. The first is taking it out of salt, and the second is hard mining it. Salt has been, the salt access has been the way until relatively recently, but the lithium market is such a high demand and the prices are going up so much at the moment that this is an area which we can look to. And actually a lot of the mining in the Tibetan region has geared towards lithium, towards lead, towards zinc, and away from traditional things like copper and gold. And all of these are to feed, well, they're to feed us. They're to feed the world in the sense of the demands that come particularly from things like rare earth metals, lithium and so forth, for the production of electric vehicles, for our phones, for all of these things. I've got a sense here of the major productive centers here. This is out of High Global. You can get a lot of information from looking at investor sites. And those have increasingly dominated what has seemed to be clean production in central China. And this has generally tended to push dirty production towards the periphery, towards Xizang, towards Tibet, towards Mongolia. Again, I would just sort of reiterate the point, as you can see from this slide, that as yet, the Tibetan Plateau is less mined than most other areas of China. That is historically transforming at this point in time. There's more of a shift, and everything depends to a certain extent on the international demand for, particularly for high-end digital and electric vehicle goods. And it nonetheless serves to reconstruct the way Tibet is thought of by the Chinese state. We can see this is a Lhasa street sign. This is actually from about 2010, showing a new image, casting new brilliance, promoting the harmonious development of mining areas. And you can see the Patala Palace there in the distance. And this is one of the major ways in which the Chinese Communist Party now envisage Tibet as a strategic potential for mining resources. And I'll leave it there.
That was excellent, Martin, and I think this is very useful. We'd like to probably look at these maps much more closely to analyze, but I'm sure the other speakers in the panel, they will have some comments to say. So let me now invite Gabriel, who has also done extensive research on this subject. Gabriel, welcome again. Glad to have you in this panel, despite of the fact that you are not well. We are grateful that you could join. But maybe I could start with you by asking a couple of questions. How do you really see the recent mining activities of China in the Tibetan Plateau? Do you really see that the situation is getting alarmed and there is a crisis happening as far as climate challenges are concerned? How do you really see the recent mining activities amounts to a climate crisis in the regions? You are muted. Gabriel, you are muted.
My apologies. Okay, let's start again. Thank you, Professor Pandey. Thank you, Martin Mills. my old friend, for an excellent introduction and to set the scene. So, yes, indeed, let's look a bit more closely at mining. And mining in Tibet is indeed, as Martin Mills was saying, a big industry. The mining industry is generally big. Just a picture of how a mining conference in China, which is an annual event, can absolutely pack out a room, as in other countries of people who expect to make a fortune. But as Martin said, China specializes in being, well, first of all, the world's biggest manufacturing country, which in turn creates a demand for raw materials, and currently is really focused on establishing and maintaining a complete dominance of production of all so-called green energy products, which includes electric cars and solar power and wind power, all of which can either be located in Tibet, sourced from Tibet, and that, as Martin Mills said, is primarily copper and lithium. But also we should add that China has also in recent years become the world's biggest consumer of gold, not only for industrial use, and in fact industrial use of gold is fairly minor. It's mostly as a store of value and a very fungible way of moving assets around discreetly, which includes capital flight, that is, exporting wealth made by Chinese in China and getting it out of China and out of the reach of the party state, all of which come from Tibet, all of which, as Martin Mills so carefully explained, can be sourced from Tibet. So much so that this graphic, I think, gives you a clearer picture of China's gold production, largely from Tibet, because the copper mines that Martin referred to are also gold mines in Tibet. Copper, gold, silver, and molybdenum, which is a strategic metal in much demand these days, all occur in the same deposits. So this is perhaps a bit of a surprise to people, that although China produces, a substantial but still modest amount of gold, it dominates gold consumption as against gold production. Now, again, just shifting to copper. This is a fairly old graphic. A more current one would, be even more dramatic. But again, it shows very clearly how China dominates the actual production of copper as against the mining of copper. And I think that's an important point, because the opening up to the world, what Martin Mills, I think, quite rightly called, China's capitalist turn, meant that China globalized. China became a champion of globalization, and had access to global sources of raw materials, not only from Tibet. So if we start talking about the rapacity of China's extractivism, to label it as an ideology, it's not only Tibet. In fact, for many, many minerals, China sources its mineral supply from around the world, and that's particularly true of copper and also of lithium, because so these graphics show you the difference between China's imports of raw materials from all over the world as against China's dominance of the actual production of whether it's copper or lithium or, you know, a whole lot of other things. So at the moment, for example, Chile in South America is a much cheaper and more convenient source for China of both lithium and copper, and that limits in the short term the rapacity of China's extractivism in Tibet. The question is for how much longer? And given that we're at the start of the second Trump presidency, you know, that factor alone may mean that China sees the world that it lives in as far more precarious, and it therefore, for the sake of security, has to rely much more than in the past on domestic sources that it can completely control, namely in Tibet. So let's start looking at some actual operating copper mines. As Martin Mills said, lithium is found in rocks in the mountains of eastern Tibet, in Kham and Amdo, in Ngawa and Kanse. But while there was an enormous rush to buy up these properties, to own a slice of Tibet by all sorts of Chinese corporations that saw this as an opportunity to get rich very quickly. That rush happened a couple of years ago. Since then, a lot of these mines have not progressed because there are other sources. But here, you could, if you look a little bit ahead to an estimate by Bloomberg, you can see that it's highly likely that production will increase quite soon. So here again is the beginnings of an actual rock lithium mine with the Chinese workforce, and they do seem to be all Han Chinese, partly because to work in a modern mining operation, you need literacy in the one common language, which of course is Putonghua Standard Chinese. So you can be certain that even if a mine is in Tibet, it's not actually providing employment for Tibetans, although employment in mining generally is a pretty small source of employment, because mining these days uses a lot of capital, a lot of technology, and not so many workers, even in China, where workers are cheap and readily replaceable. So I'm just showing you a few shots of existing mines, many of which, this again is a lithium mine, Tianqi, Ganfeng. It's still modest. It might look like a big industrial site, but rock lithium mining, which again is what this is, despite the lake in the background, is still in a slightly experimental stage. But the point is that all of the market projections and expectations and International Energy Agency forward projections say that after a slight pause last year, maybe into this year too, in lithium prices, and therefore an imbalance between supply and demand, the demand will resume, and the lithium production from both the salt lakes of Tibet and here up in the hills from mining the rock lithium will accelerate again. So while I would hesitate to use the word rapacity for what's happening right at the moment, that might yet be a very accurate descriptor of what's happening. So here is the website of one of the main companies. We were looking at one of their mining operations before, and these are companies that feed directly into the big brands of lithium battery electric power cars that are on the streets right now as we speak of most major cities around the world. So if you're tempted to buy a Tesla or a BYD, which are the two biggest brands, all the evidence suggests that they are already building their batteries that power the car, that drive the car, and the entertainment system in the car that is their strong selling point and why they sell more strongly than European cars. And the lithium for those batteries is coming increasingly from Tibet. BYD is very proud of having got a monopoly on lithium from some of the salt lakes of Tibet. Where Tesla gets its lithium from is not entirely clear. It's not all from domestic sourcing within China, meaning Tibet, but increasingly it is. So again, there is enormous interest by investors in China in making quick profits from the rush into lithium, into the battery mining sector. Now, Martin Mills mentioned the salt in the lakes, and in the lakes of especially Amdo in northern Tibet, which is quite an arid area. This is an extremely shallow lake. In order to extract the lithium, literally all you need is a bulldozer, a front-end loader, a very basic machine, which just simply scoops it out of the lake bed, which is literally only inches or at the most a metre deep, and just pile it up so that the water drains away, and there you've got the salt. It is that simple. Where the complications start is in separating all the different salts, because the salts in the salt lakes are a mixture of magnesium, potassium, sodium, and lithium salts, and separating them to the level of purity required for battery manufacture is very tricky, and that is why lithium salt lake production in Tibet is languishing, but it might yet pick up very, very quickly if and as when China and other lithium producers around the world solve the problem of how to extract lithium sufficiently purely so that the batteries don't overheat and explode. So I don't want to go any further.
I would
That'll
request
do.
you to wind up in a couple of minutes, maybe, and then we can go.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I think I'm almost at the. Then probably I've been bombarding people with some maybe a bit of an overload. Look, I'll just finish here. This is a story that was in the Financial Times only a couple of days ago, and it's a sign of the times. The European car industry has been so shocked by how sophisticated the Chinese lithium-powered cars are that they've now almost in desperation adopted a new strategy of, rather than going the American way of simply banning or putting punitive tariffs, they're actually saying, well, 20, 30 years ago, the Chinese wanted us to set up our European car factories in China so that they could learn or steal all of our technology. Now that they are technologically ahead of us, let's welcome them to build their car factories in Europe, and then we can learn from their technology. And all of this technology, and when a Chinese car factory is built in Europe, the lithium batteries are imported from China. So that's in a nutshell is where we are at the moment. And thank you. I'll leave it there.
This is excellent and very educative, and thank you very much for sharing this. Let me quickly move to other panelists. Maybe Dr. Sripana, you would like to share your thoughts, how much the Chinese have gone ahead in terms of mining activities in the Tibetan regions, and what impact you see, making it to the climate conditions in Tibet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Panda and ISDP. I'll just keep my points short because the previous panelists have already delved in depth into the scope of Chinese mining activities. China way back in 2007 conducted a $50 million 7-year government survey of the Tibetan Plateau, and it discovered considerable deposits, including 40 million tons each of copper, zinc, and lead, and more than 1 billion ton of high grade iron. Now, Tibet also has uranium, borax, and potash. In fact, Tibet is thought to have some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, which, as Martin mentioned, is a vital ingredient in batteries, which power today's mobile phones, laptops, and which could conceivably fuel the next generation of road transport as well. So this 2.4 million tons of lithium carbonate, these deposits at Chabue, Tamsung, and Taichinayat salt lakes are among the world's largest. Extraction is only just getting underway. In 2023, Chinese scientists discovered huge potential reserves of rare earth minerals in the Himalayas, which could give a boost to its position as the leading global supplier. So, the researchers from China University of Geosciences in Wuhan used AI to locate these deposits, which are spread across a land stretch of 1,000 kilometers, located in the Tibetan Plateau. So China was building this AI system, which it eventually used in 2023 to locate the deposits. This sort of AI system was being built since 2020. The project was led by Zhuo Rangguang and his team. They built the AI-based system to scan raw satellite data to locate new rare earth metal deposits. And Professor Zhuo actually wrote in a peer-reviewed paper, which was published in Chinese language, the Chinese language journal Earth Science Frontiers, that the focus of mining will mainly shift to rare earth metals. Now, rare earth metals are irreplaceable in emerging industries such as new materials, new energy, defense, military technology, information technology, and so on. So it's a key strategic mineral resource in global competition. Now, the country's China's researchers believe that the discovery will tilt the balance more in China's favor. China's share of global reserves had dropped from 43% in the 1980s and 1990s to 36.7% in 2021. Meanwhile, rare earth resources also have seen significant growth, outside China, more than doubling in the same period. This rapid change in technology has actually made rare earth materials or minerals an important part in many applications, ranging from energy to defense applications and so on. About a decade ago, the Chinese accidentally discovered rare earth materials and as well as lithium in some rock samples from Tibet, which led them to work towards developing AI and new sorts of AI tools. Carbon emissions is a global concern. It's not just a concern for China. But the fact also is that in the name of carbon emissions and green transition, China is continuing to develop its mines and mining in Tibet. So these are some of the few materials. I would, very briefly also touch upon gold, which also Martin mentioned, when he was speaking. In February 2024, which is last year, Zhejiang Mining Group, which is China's biggest listed gold producer, received local government approval for the second phase of expansion of its Chulong copper project in Tibet. This clearance made the site the largest single copper mine in the PRC. Zhejiang Mining had to stop production at one of its mines in the Tibetan Plateau, near Tibet's capital in Lhasa, in 2023, in May, when there was an accident which left 6 people working for a subcontractor missing. And the company, strangely enough, or maybe not strangely enough, was given clearance to resume production shortly afterwards without any clear information about the missing miners. The 6 miners appeared to have lost their lives, as the company referred to them as fatalities. In 2024, again, China Gold International Resources announced that phase 2 processing of this plant at the Chiama mine in Tibet, in China, has resumed operations after being halted for a year. So, these are just two examples from just last year, and it just shows as to how much China is interested in expanding mining, because there are several uh, minerals which are all of importance for China, for various different reasons, primarily for strategic reasons, also for economic reasons. Well, China's politics and economics cannot really be separated. So this is just the beginning, and as China's economic growth rates continue to decline further, there will be more mining. As China tries to show itself as a responsible player in the realm of climate change, there will be more mining activities in Tibet, and this is just the beginning. So thank you so much for listening.
No, thank you. I think that was excellent. I'm sure there will be some comments coming from our participants who are listening this conversation. I would request all the panelists to have a look in the Q&A box so that in the second round, you could take some of these questions from the audience. But with a quick note, let me invite now Shuja to share your views about the subject, how much you see that the Chinese have advances as far as mining is concerned in the Tibetan Plateau.
Thank you, Jagannath, and thank you to your team as well for organizing this event this evening. I am in Taipei, so for me it is evening, not for perhaps most of you, but it's very much an honor to join the panel, and I'm in a bit of a difficulty because pretty much everything was said already in terms of latest developments. So I am going to perhaps maybe improvise a little bit, because I don't want to clearly repeat some of the things that were said, but perhaps also bring a European perspective on the issue. So speaking obviously of the Chinese mining operations and exploitation of critical raw materials, or CRM, in the Tibetan Plateau, I think context matters. So that's exactly how also Martin, you started your presentation, and I am, I think, on the exact same page with you, how much context matters. Because when we talk about CRM, we're talking, in fact, about the race for advanced technology, which is a race for global leadership, because whoever sets the standards in technology and whoever has access to those materials is closer to global leadership. And we need to talk about China's role in this race. As much as we need to talk, and this is the second point I will elaborate on, is to talk about the PRC win-win narrative concerning its projects in Tibet. Including the development projects, including mining, versus the reality on the ground. And also the reality of what this does in terms of PRC operations to the Tibetan community, in terms of their livelihoods, that it displaces and disempowers Tibetans across the plateau. So narrative shaping, I think, is a very important dimension of this conversation. So that's at least one thing that was not yet said. So perhaps I will elaborate on that a little more. So first on the CRM question. So as I said, whoever leads in CRM is going to be able to perhaps lead globally. And most headlines say that China is winning the race. Indeed, China has been able to dominate the CRM market, also because this is something that is essential to decarbonization and digitization, which means that in reality, PRC accounts for more than 80% of the global solar cell exports, more than 50% of lithium-ion batteries, and more than 20% of EVs. Now, there's two factors to stress here. China has had an early start to invest in CRM, and also it's been a very consistent policy approach with subsidies, tax incentives, credits, which also clearly is relevant to what Chinese-backed companies do in Tibet in terms of exploitation. Also, official policy support goes back to the mid-2000s. That's why I said that China had an early start. And this is where, speaking from a European perspective, we are catching up, but I'll get to that in a little while. And so in addition to that early start, also the PRC has skillfully, I would say, strategically aligned its trade and also national engagement strategies with countries that are resource rich. are ramping up acquisition of copper, cobalt, or lithium mining projects globally beyond Tibet. This includes Africa, Latin America. In Africa in particular, there's a concentration of mining in 5 countries: Guinea, Zambia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the DRC. But I will not go into that, just to stay focused. So speaking of copper, China also dominates all phases of copper production and use. So from the ownership of major copper mines in Tibet, but also in Congo, Peru, in Chile, Zambia, to global shipping of copper concentrate to smelters based in China, to the manufacturing of copper-intensive technology, wind turbines, solar panels. So in Tibet, and this was already expanded on earlier, China has been expanding its production. Shriparna, you spoke already earlier about some projects that have seen expansion, so I will not spend any time on that. Speaking of lithium, again, I think you also mentioned that there's been a discovery of about 1 million tons of lithium in January, about a year ago, in Kham, and also gold reserves. And that what I read is that there's a talk about making Lhasa a mining hub for copper and lithium. So the expansion is also what my research confirms. And this is driven by China's interest in dominating and essentially securing lithium supply chains. And so if we address this slightly from a European perspective, in the race of CRM, clearly we are very much reliant on China, on a single supplier. And that, just to give you a few numbers here, we are dependent on China for 98% of the rare earth supply in Europe, also 97% of lithium. And perhaps this is something we can again discuss in the other sections, so that again, I move on to the second point I wanted to make, which is the narrative versus reality on the ground. Again, I speak not based on research I could conduct on the ground, because there are clearly restrictions. I think we need to talk about the fact that as a result of that restriction, our research is based on what's available, conducted by Tibetan also think tanks such as the Tibet Policy Institute in Dharamsala and their experts. I myself use and have been very lucky to be able to use such research. But what the narrative is, and I think that's not a difficulty, there's no difficulty in reading about Beijing's narrative. As we all know, the development narrative is that China, as opposed to other great powers, does not seek to exploit communities and local communities, but seeks win-win cooperation, and clearly the goal has been to use and exploit Tibet for economic growth, and to eradicate absolute poverty by increasing rural disposable incomes. So that has required displacing Tibetan nomads and farmers, and to change their livelihoods. So I think this is the reality on the ground. Now, what mining companies have done is to follow the official narrative coming out of Beijing, which is that mining companies have a very sustainable approach to the environment, that they seek to contribute to the livelihoods of the local communities. But I think where Europeans, also speaking from the Europeans' perspective again, I think this is where we have, in a way, a responsibility to follow the narrative and also to shed light on what is happening on the ground. And I think perhaps we will get back to that question again in the other section in terms of what the international community can do. But I think it's very important to shed light and more light on the narrative that Beijing has been pursuing and where that takes us in terms of climate change. And I think that's, again, another point that we will elaborate on. So I think I stop here to give us more time for further points, and happy to take your questions when we get there.
Thank you, Suja. I think your point about the European dependencies on China when it comes to critical minerals is well taken, and I think that that narrative, that point would definitely be one of the defining point how to really, negotiate or enter into a discussion with China when it comes to minerals and exploration of mineral activities in the Tibet. Lobsang, last but not least, I'm sure you have so many interesting things to say being a Tibetan Tibetan by yourself. I'm sure you are covering some of these issues very closely for a number of years. So I'm sure you have some interesting insights to share. How do you see how far the Chinese have gone in terms of exploring the mining resources in Tibet?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so I think I would not repeat the points that have raised earlier, but then as we have also, in the discussion focused on the infrastructure development, right? So when we see the Chinese mining activities, so infrastructure development has really, helped them in terms of to carry forward the mining activities. The second, I think, why we could see mining activities in Tibet is the no environmental safety costs. So since there is no environmental safety costs, meaning meaning the Chinese government officials are often, they are either bribed by the miners, or the Chinese official themselves are involved in the mining operation, and so it becomes very easy for them to get the legal the mining license and to have that freedom to carry. And in that process, there were like research saying that in terms of environment impact assessment, the mining companies, they find it more easier to bribe the governments than the to carry the environment impact assessment. So that could also act why we see so many mining activities in Tibet. And then I think the second issue would be if we compare with the other countries. I mean, one is that there is no proper Tibetan organized environment groups to focus on the mining issue. So because of that, as Sir Jagannath, Sir, you have raised that there has not been much of the mining, international attention on mining, because if you do a research on mining, it is impossible for you to go to Tibet and to do so. There are hardly any, only few like Martin and Girbel. Otherwise, there are hardly any, scholars outside Tibet to do a proper, the field research on mining in Tibet. So that's why, having a proper, accurate data and, the field research becomes very, very difficult in Tibet as well. And then when we talk about the lithium mining and the other, the mining activities, goals and all, what happens is that, how do the Chinese government, gets the land, right? So in that process, since, as Martin said, like since 2000s, there has been, heavy Chinese investment in the minings. And since 2000s, there are other, infrastructure development projects they carry forward. And then in the name of ecological development, nomads relocation, policies implemented as well. So there has been, pasture land grabbing, and then so land grabbing issue become very, very frequent because of the mining activity. And then in terms of the climate change, and then you were also, so you were talking about the Himalaya belt or the neighboring countries. most of these mine areas are near the heads of the Asia's biggest, rivers like Yangtze, Yalong, Mekong, and Brahmaputra. So, which means that when you do a mining, it pollutes the river, and then these rivers flows in the Tibet's neighboring countries. So that means the mining issue that we see is not only a Tibet focused issue, but it has impact on its neighboring countries as well. Another issue why I would say that mining is the one of the major reason why we see lots of environment protests in Tibet, and that one reason could be mining at the sacred mountains. So the Tibetan Buddhism and also Pön religion believes on the sacred mountains, and since most of these minings have happened at the sacred mountains, there has been lots of people, Tibetans, protesting, and also self-immolations have happened at the mining site as well. So in 2016, Amchok, protest happened because there has been mining at the sacred mountain as well. And finally, I think I would like to say that at one time, the Chinese government, they promotes nature reserves and national parks. And then if you look from India perspective or outside, everyone thinks that to have nature reserves and national parks are really, really important to protect the land. But then one example would be the Xizang nature reserves, where it was formed in 2000, and this area becomes the head of the three big river, Yellow, Yangtze, and Mekong. And then they formed the Xizang Nature Reserve in 2000. And then in 2013, the Chinese officials, they issue mining license for resource extraction in Zato. So Zato is in Xizang area. And when they formed the Xizang area, many of the Tibetan nomads were relocated, removed from that area. And then you have a national park. And then, you give a license for mining area. And then in 2013, especially the case in Zato, Eastern Tibet, in the Xizang National Reserve area. So it's very difficult to understand, how this functions. So basically, I mean, yes, I personally really welcome to have a national parks, but then you formed a national park, you removed Tibetan nomads, and then you give license for the mining. So that doesn't sound right at all. Thank you.
Very useful remarks, Lobsang. In fact, your 4-5 points: lack of international knowledge group on the subject, lack of proper data because we don't have the access, accession or the access, that kind of luxury to go to Tibet and try to collect data there. Then some of these mining areas are very close to the rivers, and the mining which is happening in the sacred mountains, that is also a point needs to be taken. And of course, the displacement of the Tibetans. These are worrisome factors, but I'm sure the international community will take note of some of these issues. But this also encouraged me to go to the next round, which we could make it a final round because we are only left with 30 minutes. And since we have a 5-member panel, so I would request each panel members just to stick to 5 minutes each. So there is a couple of questions I will club together and I will invite your comments. At the same time, I would also request you to have a look at the Q&A. There are already a lot of comments and questions have come up. So if you could answer some of these questions, that will be great. My couple of questions are that how do you really see that the mining activities of the Chinese in the Tibetan Plateau are going to affect the Himalayan ecology per se? What kind of awareness, knowledge building exercise we could do at the Himalayan regions? Can we take the help of, let's say, UNFCCC or IMOD or any other international action groups which are dealing with climate change? Can we really create a necessary international coalitions to bring to the global audience to their attention and talk about some of these issues and probably invite the Chinese to the negotiating table? So your comments will be very useful on this. So I'll again start with Martin and then proceed with the Gabriel in the same order. Over
Okay,
to you.
thank you. Yeah, these are large questions. I mean, one of the problems we need to think is we need to look at the larger geopolitical context here. You know, we're moving into a stage where almost every state in the world, and particularly the large states, and that includes, I hasten to add, the present American government, generally speaking, broadly accept actually that climate change is occurring. One of the major things they're interested in doing is protecting their political continuity in that context. And that largely involves protecting the interests and the consumption patterns of the middle class that has grown up in China and America and Europe over the last 50 or 60 years, and doubling down on their needs. And EV cars is a classic example of that. To achieve that, however, you need to control resource hinterlands. Tibet is a good case of that. South China Seas, even we could think about the recent debates about Greenland. You know, China presently uses almost all of South America's soybean production, for example, to feed pigs because of pork demand amongst middle-class Chinese, which even when I first went there in the 1980s was a very rare thing to eat. Now it's eaten daily. Okay, so one of the things that we're carrying is we're moving into a political domain in which people understand that you need to grab resources, food resources, mineral resources, and you need to create a hinterland, and you need to control those hinterlands. And Tibet is part of that, but Inner Asia, South America, all of those are part of that. Now, in that sense, we've got two responses to climate change that are occurring. Now, on the Tibetan Plateau, the specific issues there are control of mineral resources and control of water. Now, water was raised here. At a local pattern, mining is often very bad for local water resources. Mines involve the release of and use of a wide variety of very nasty chemicals that, generally speaking, often render areas infertile, create high cancer rates, poisoning rates. Animals can't live there. So that's a local problem. We also see, in terms of things like climate change, we see regional effects, which is things like black carbon deposition from the North Indian corridor, in particular. On a larger effect, you know, Tibet is, to a large extent, one of the things people often don't know about climate change is that it increases with altitude up to the top of the troposphere, and Tibet is closer to the top of the troposphere. So, you know, Tibet is, to a certain extent, about 100 years ahead of most sea level areas in terms of climate change. And this is dramatically affecting its water resources and underground hydrology, its permafrost sources, all of these kinds of things. So major changes are occurring. Now, the Chinese Communist Party are entirely aware of this. The Chinese Academy of Sciences have been telling them for a very, very long time. And they are thinking in those terms, but they're not responding the way Europeans respond. They're going, well, how do we ensure a future for the Chinese Communist Party and for China in that context, in that context? And that's a really kind of major problem that people have. A lot of people kind of, for example, one of the questions was, do I buy an EV car? And if what's better for the climate, as it were? Well, the truth of the matter is the shift to green technologies is going to damage the environment just as much as fossil fuels will do, because the question is not what technology we're using, it's how much energy and resource we are consuming across the board. Now, that problem has just got worse. It's got worse since we first discovered about climate change 150 years ago. It's worse since it became a political issue. It's worse since we knew that we are heading directly into the path of this steam train as far as this is concerned. And we are simply not learning because there is a move to double down on middle-class living standards. And that involves, effectively speaking, the massive rapacious use of resources in areas like Tibet and Central Asia.
Thank you very much, Martin. I completely agree with you. Gabriel, I'm sure you have some comments to offer.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I think your question was, you know, what prospect is there for some sort of effective global response to this? And I'm a little pessimistic. I think Losang Yangso very helpfully reminded us that Tibetans scattered in exile around the world have yet to create an environmental NGO to consistently speak up on this issue. so it only attracts sporadic attention. Martin Mills just reminded us that, China's rhetoric is of being, the global champion, the global leader of the green energy revolution, even though the production, let's say, of lithium batteries in China actually relies heavily on coal-fired electricity at all stages of the actual refining and manufacturing of the lithium batteries. So people who've done assessments of the green credentials of China's lithium batteries come back with saying they're not really any better than petrol gas-powered engines, as long as they're produced in China. But where is the world? The world seems to have opted for the rather simplistic assumption that as anything and everything that reduces our carbon emissions is the magical solution. And China proclaims its credentials as, the world's leader in not only lithium batteries, but solar power and wind energy and maybe hydrogen in the near future. And so a lot of environmentalists actually, do argue that China is the key, and maybe now that we have a President Trump, they may even more strongly embrace China as the world's great hope for a simplistic tech solution to the climate crisis, and that anything and everything must be done in order to reduce the emissions that are heating the planet. And so if Tibet is to be sacrificed, well, that's very unfortunate, but may be necessary. I think in response, we have yet to tackle that. I would personally tackle it by saying, well, actually, China is the world's biggest emitter and is the world's biggest manufacturer and is determined to stay that way. So there is a fundamental contradiction. And let me just say one last point. Some of the questions about China's announced finding, which always sounds very impressive, of 25 tons of gold reserves, and there was mention earlier of 1 million tons of lithium. These are highly speculative free judgments, projections by geologists who have not thoroughly explored mineral deposits, and they tell you almost nothing about the economics of actually extracting the minerals. So I think we need to look a bit more closely at those grandiose claims that China makes. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Gabriel. Suparna?
Yeah, I'll just quickly try to answer if these intergovernmental organizations or international climate forums have been able to do justice, or can they be looked at for achieving dissemination of information. If we look at some of these organizations, the IPCC, UNFCCC, UNEP, and ICIMOD, what is generally seen is that after largely overlooking Tibet in the past so many years or in several reports, finally there is a bit of a change, very small, a minuscule change. For example, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2019 published a special report on ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, and this was released just when the world leaders were meeting at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. And it's mentioned melting of glaciers along the Hindu Kush, along the Himalayan range, but nothing specifically about Tibet. The UN process has shown little appetite for addressing the urgent climate crisis on the Tibetan Plateau. It's because of China's apathy. Tibet is not recognized as a country, unfortunately. So, expecting that a UN organization or anything related to the UN would show any sort of care or concern for Tibet is a bit too far fetched. China is a part of the P5 at the United Nations. At the UNEP, again, there is one report which is a joint report by the WTO and the UNEP from 2008, which talks about trade and climate change. Tibet is mentioned just once in that long report of 168 pages, and it's not Tibet per se. It's rather as to how global warming is happening, and there are these parts, Central Asia, Tibetan Plateau, Northern Asia, where where the temperature is changing. That's about it. One word, rather two words, Tibetan Plateau, in that long 168 pages of report. Now, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, it has published several reports on climate change in Tibet and the Himalayas, and these reports have warned that climate change is causing significant melting of glaciers and ice in the region, and so on. It's an intergovernmental organization, so well, yes, there's been some sort of publication of reports, but we possibly need to think of what beyond publication of reports, what beyond creation of awareness. So we'll probably have to think about that. There's just one question which I saw in the chat box, and I'll just probably take a jibe at it in a very short span of time. The question was on, do Tibetans actually benefit from the mining in Tibet, or does the PRC actually benefit? Tibetans actually don't benefit from the mining. They experience negative effects of mining, including environmental degradation, loss of land, and displacement. I think Lobsang had briefly mentioned as to why there are so many protests. In terms of environmental degradation, mining consumes large amounts of water. Mining waste can make water undrinkable in nearby communities. Mining can destroy traditional farmlands, natural reserves. It can pollute sacred grasslands, and so on. Tibetans have also been displaced from their land and relocated to urban settlements. Tibetans have seen their livestock and water supply poisoned. Pasture lands have been reduced. They have been depleted. There's massive displacement. And the worst thing is that there's a lack of consultation. Tibetans are rarely consulted about extraction projects. And if at all Tibetans do voice their concerns, they are penalized. So the benefits are not really trickling. China had announced the Go West strategy or Look West strategy way back in the year 2000, but we are sitting in 2025. Why is it that China still talks about developing Tibet if it was supposed to be so great and so beneficial? So that's my two. That's just what I think, and that's what I have read so far. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very useful. Suja, over to you.
Yes. Can you? Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So again, just to complement some of the things that were said, because you, Jagannath, you raised the question of international response and cooperation, and I think the question there is, what is the effectiveness of whatever the international community can do? And just like Shriparna said, to go beyond reports. So I'd like to just mention here, I was listening to the president of the European Commission speak at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And speaking of China, she said that, and I'm just looking at my notes here, that Paris Agreement remains best hope for humanity, still on top of the agenda. And on China, linking this also, she said that, I believe we should strive for mutual benefits in our conversations with China. We must engage constructively with China to find solutions. I mean, clearly, this is, in a way, a sense of direction to see how we can actually move on in terms of tackling climate change as something that is a global challenge. I think there is consensus on that, but I think I'm less optimistic in terms of how we can actually get to a point from the Europeans' perspective to kind of manage to avoid a race to the bottom. That's something else that she said in her discourse at Davos. So I think beyond reports and awareness raising, I think parliamentary diplomacy remains extremely essential. And I think, again, the European Parliament, when it comes to what is happening inside Tibet, has played a role in raising awareness among member states to keep the issue of the environment to degradation as a result of exploitation by Beijing in Tibet. That's something that I think has helped. again, I think I've said this before in our previous webinars, that when it comes to a focus on Tibet from the European side, it's always, or I think it's been mostly dominated by a focus on the human rights situation, so religious freedom, right to education, and I think the environmental dimension of what is happening in Tibet has not received as much attention. And I say that as someone who's worked in the European Parliament for 12 years. So I've worked on these EP resolutions with much interest and with much support, because it is important to speak about cultural and political rights, but as much as it is important to speak about the economic and social rights. And to add on to what Sriparna said about the impact of the mining projects on the Tibetan community, clearly it is a negative impact, because the profit is clearly only going to those who exploit the land and not those who have the knowledge of the land. So awareness raising is important, and I think Europe has to do more. I think, and I started with the engagement of China, because I think no one's going anywhere, as difficult as it is, and it might sound perhaps wishful thinking that we can actually engage China positively, but I think we have to consider that option, because global climate change is a global issue. So with Trump back in the White House, and a European Commission that is more assertive on China, perhaps we can and we will see more conversations on this, but I'll stop here because I see that time is running out.
Yeah, thank you, Suja. Lobsang, quickly, over to you.
Sure, yeah. I think before I answer, maybe I would answer the one of question regarding unavailability of the data.
Right.
So when we talk about mining, I think it's really, really important to have a proper data. And nowadays, we get information about mining in specific mining in Tibet only when there is a protest, a huge protest happens. And once that protest happens, then the Tibetans inside Tibet, they smuggle the video or information, and then only we get, some news attention or very, very limited global media attention on that. So I think if you have a freedom to, go to the visit, then talk to the local people and, and then see which are the companies, which are the foreign companies, involved in the mining areas, and how much, that mining really benefits the local people, and whether it has done environment impact assessment. So all these kind of, I think, informations is really, really, really important if you want to carry on that specific information at the UN level, or at even writing a good report. So these kind of informations are really, really important. So with international organization, as Shirprana said, I'm sometimes also Gabriel said, right, it's like very like I also get a very pessimistic view, because when you deal with the international organizations, so they are like other stakeholders, they said that, oh, China really funds this group or UN, and so that has a huge impact, because China funds lots of UN international forums or organizations. So that really impacts on that. And then secondly, I mean, at the UN, even to look at the COP meetings, as Shiprana said, Tibet does not have an official representation to make any statement at the UN climate change conferences or meetings, right? And then unfortunately, right now at the UN climate change conferences, there is no special platform for colonized people. So they don't hear what we have to say. They don't want to hear what we have to say. So we don't have any platform in that. So in that case, I think right now, I think the whole international system, it's not very favorable for communities like us. And then secondly, I think international organizations, maybe what I realize is that, I mean, they also have a responsibility of to check accountability, transparency, and track the country-specific progress in terms of climate commitments. So I think in that case, I think these organizations, forums should ask for accountability and transparency, and how much the policy commitment has actual positive impact and inside Tibet. So that kind of information is, I feel like it's missing right now. And then, to be honest, I think when we interact with the other, the governments, if not the, UN organization, even the neighboring countries, they really tend to shy away and not discuss about Tibet. And I have my own experience at the one of the UN COP meeting where they were talking about Brahmaputra, and the representatives were from the downstream countries. And when they were discussing Brahmaputra, none of the speakers mentioned Tibet. And I was just wondering, how can you talk about Brahmaputra, not even discuss what's happening at the upstream of the Brahmaputra? So that's the, I think, reality that I see right now.
Agree, Lobsang, and I think this is a critical question for rest of the Himalayan communities, whether we could really talk about Tibet quite openly, what's happening there. We precisely have 8 minutes, so we will go for a kind of a very quick round again. Just 1 minute remarks from each one of you. I will start in the reverse order. First Lobsang, then Sujan, Sriparna, Gabriel, and then we'll end up with Martin, so that Martin, you could have a little couple of minutes more to comment on the international organization that you wanted to comment earlier. My direct question is, what the Himalayan community should do to raise some of these issues, or prepare a future action plan where we could raise some of these issues to make China feel responsible or take proper action to protect the climate conditions in Tibet. What would be the precise role of the Himalayan states like Nepal, Bhutan, India, and other countries in the region? In 1 minute, you have to answer. So I'll start with Lobsang, you.
Sure, thank you. We all know that the whole Himalaya belt is very, very sensitive with the climate change. And recently we have seen, earthquake in, Shikatse in Tibet as well. So, and then, right now what we witness is a huge infrastructure development in terms of damming and mining at the whole Himalaya belt. And at the end, so this whole Himalaya local communities are the ones who contribute least for the climate change. But once we have a climate change impact, so they are the most vulnerable with the climate change impact. So I feel that the whole Himalaya community should come together and ask governments to protect the whole Himalaya belt and understand the fragile and ecosystem of the whole Himalaya belt, and then not build too much of hydropower or too much of mining activities, because we have witnessed the earthquake in Nepal as well. So it's a very sensitive area, very earthquake prone zone. So Himalaya community should come together as a collective voice and then really strongly ask the companies and the governments to protect the ecosystem.
So need for a collective voice from the Himalayan region. Thank you. Suja, over to you. 1 minute.
Thank you. Well, Lobsang put it really nicely in terms of having a collective voice. And I think using that collective voice is essential to building partnerships with those partners outside of the region who lack the knowledge, because the only people who have that local knowledge are the people affected within the region. So I think on one hand, we need to build those partnerships, strengthen, because there is already ongoing discussion on this. So it's not like we have to start from zero. But beyond the building of the partnership, I think I go back to that engagement part of China. And I think we need to find a way to to resolve these difficult questions that we have and the tension we have in our relationship with China, using the leverage that we have. And I think balancing that relationship is, but that's on us. That's not on the community. That's more on the, say, the developed countries that are complicit in what is happening with the demand that they have vis-a-vis China.
Right, point well taken. Building partnership using local knowledge. Over to you, Sriparna.
Unfortunately, I have a very pessimistic view over here because the Himalayan countries are Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. Now, of course, with the exception of China, it leaves Bhutan, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. Nepal and Pakistan are deeply influenced by China. It's undertaking a lot of economic projects and so much and so on and so on. So much so that, even Nepal continuously deports Tibetans from Nepal. So I do not expect much from the Himalayan countries per se. India, well, yes, even recently when China has announced this mega project on the Yalung Sangpo, India has raised concerns and India has said that India will protect its interests. So what I think is that maybe there's a need also to build partnerships between the countries or the communities from within the Himalayan countries, which would be able to speak up or would be able to do something with partners from outside the region, because climate change in this region, in what is the roof of the world, is going to eventually impact every other community in the world as well. Unfortunately, China's influence is very deep in Nepal and Pakistan, so I really do not expect much. Bhutan does not have official relations with China, so again, I do not expect too much from there as well. So, but if there is the civil society which can be leveraged, maybe that's one step forward. I'm sorry, I don't have a very coherent answer, and I have a very pessimistic perspective to this.
So if I could summarize, India has to take the lead and find probably partners who could share India's thoughts about the climate condition in the Himalayan regions. So we have to find partners.
It has to be a look beyond the region.
Useful. Gabriel, over to you for 1 minute.
Sriparna is pessimistic with good reason if we look at the Himalaya as countries in a geopolitical way. But she and Losang Yangtze have mentioned the damming of rivers, and I would suggest that Himalayan communities have actually been quite successful in delaying or even stopping the construction of dams. If you look at the central planners in Delhi, who look enviously at the flow of rivers in Arunachal, Assam, Uttarakhand, in Nepal, in Bhutan, if they had their way, they would have already built as many dams in the south side of the Himalayas as China is doing on the north side. And I think to a large extent, it's community objections to those massive dam projects as totally inappropriate and useless for local community benefit. So I wouldn't be, on balance, quite as pessimistic. I do think that there is tremendous scope for community organization and solidarity, especially when it comes to dams and hopefully also mining.
So community objection, solidarity, and organizational setup, probably they could raise and work together. Excellent, thank you. Martin, last words from you. You have 3 minutes now.
I have 3 minutes. All right. Well, Suza is going to have to excuse me, and don't take it personally, but I'm going to disagree with you. Much of the failings of climate change science and politics over the last 20 to 30 years come from actually conceiving it as purely global. Actually, this is something that the IPCC had been doing for a very long time, since the MIT Rome report came out. And it was one of the difficulties we had in doing a regional report for the third pole region, and Itamod had similar questions, which is IPCC never talk about regional assays of what will happen when various climate change effects and environmental effects come together in a particular area of the world. And those things, nation states don't like them existing because they affect things like wheat futures and national security. If you say what will happen in the next 50 years, to India, to Tibet, to China, that is actually quite dangerous information, but it's vital for democracies. So here's a question, which is, no, we actually need to think a bit more locally, a little bit more regionally about those questions, and we need to stop framing it purely in this kind of rather abstract way about sort of global nature. And the reason for this, of course, is the practical one. In the end of the day, you know, the practical results may not be humanly driven. The railway between Lhasa and Golmud, for example, as the Chinese Academy of Sciences have been shouting about for quite a while, is beginning to destabilize because atmospheric warming is melting the permafrost on which it was built. And so you may not be actually able to transport those minerals in due course because your railway won't be there. The Zipumpu Dam, for example, back in 2008, was strongly implicated in the eastern Tibetan earthquake that killed 90,000 people and cost 170 billion in rebuild costs, because dams produce earthquakes, all right? And we've known that since the 30s. In the end of the day, nature doesn't come to conferences, it doesn't negotiate, and President Trump, it doesn't cut deals. It will not budge on the consequences of our actions.
Thank you, Matt. I think you all would agree with me that it has been an excellent discussion today. And I think this is a subject we need more discussion, more clarity, and probably more research. And events like these encourage us to think more deliberately whether we could actually collect data through discussion, through different sources, collecting information and putting it together. So in that way, this webinar will be recorded and will be placed in our website. Those who are participating, they could again listen to this conversation. But I'm sure for the wider audience, for the international community, this will be a huge source of information and knowledge gathering, a kind of sources for their knowledge, what's happening in the Tibetan region as far as the mining exploration resources are concerned. We will also prepare a report out of this discussion and share with all of you, and publish that report in ISDP website, which could be also read by some of our readers and also those who are interested in the Tibetan affairs. With this note, let me thank all of my colleagues in ISDP who has been tremendously helpful for putting this webinar. Anna Jarmuth, Toby and Julia, my colleagues from the Indo-Pacific Center, thank you very much for helping me out for arranging this webinar. And also, I take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for finding time. It's been so useful a discussion. Your knowledge and your informations on such a rarely discussed topic has been very useful, and I think ISDP is also very benefited out of this webinar. Special thanks to Gabriel for finding time and not being best of health, still making time to speak in this webinar. But we will stay in touch with all of you for our future webinar, for our future research programs. I'm going to write to all of you for our future activities, and we hope to engage with you for our future projects and publications on this subject. So thank you very much and have a good evening and have a good week ahead. I hope to meet you online or in person soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.